What if the God described in the Bible isn't the benevolent, all-loving creator we've been taught to believe in? For centuries, believers have revered him as the ultimate source of morality and goodness. But a closer reading of the scriptures reveals something unsettling: repeated acts of cruelty, injustice, and wrath that challenge this image. In this video, we'll explore 5 key reasons some argue that the God of the Bible, as portrayed in Scripture, appears not as a figure of pure goodness, but as one capable of immense harm. This is not an attack on personal faith, it's an exploration of the text itself. One of the most disturbing patterns in the Old Testament is God's direct command to annihilate entire populations. In books like Joshua, Deuteronomy, and 1 Samuel, God orders the destruction of entire cities, men, women, children, and even livestock, simply because they belong to enemy nations or worship other gods. The Canaanites, Amalekites, and Midianites were not given a chance for peace. Instead, they were subjected to extermination as divine judgment. From a moral standpoint, genocide is among humanity's greatest evils, yet in these passages, it's sanctioned and commanded by the deity himself. Critics argue that this undermines the idea of God as the source of objective morality. If we judge such acts today as crimes against humanity, how do we reconcile them with the belief that God is perfectly good and just? This contradiction forms one of the strongest arguments for those who challenge the benevolent image of the biblical God. In both the Old and New Testaments, slavery is not only acknowledged, it's regulated. The Mosaic Law in Exodus and Leviticus provides instructions for owning slaves, including rules on inheritance, punishment, and treatment. While some claim this was more humane than other ancient systems, it still allowed humans to own other humans as property. In the New Testament, rather than abolishing slavery, figures like Paul tell slaves to obey their masters as they would obey Christ, Ephesians 6:5. This lack of outright condemnation raises a moral dilemma. If God is perfectly just and loving, why didn't he clearly prohibit such an inherently oppressive system? By modern ethical standards, slavery is unquestionably evil. Yet, in the biblical text, God never declares it wrong. Instead, his laws appear to accept and perpetuate it, which many critics interpret as evidence that the biblical God's morality reflects the flawed ethics of ancient societies rather than an eternal, perfect goodness. The concept of hell in Christian doctrine presents another moral problem. According to Scripture, unbelievers, or even those who fail to follow the correct version of faith, are condemned to eternal suffering. This raises the question: how is infinite punishment justified for finite human actions committed during a short lifetime? For instance, a person could live a largely moral life, yet still be sentenced to eternal torment for failing to accept specific theological beliefs. Critics argue that such a system is disproportionate, resembling vengeance more than justice. Furthermore, the Bible presents God as both omniscient and omnipotent, meaning he knowingly creates beings who will end up in eternal suffering. This depiction challenges the idea of divine mercy and compassion, portraying instead a deity who establishes an ultimatum with eternal consequences. For many, this raises the unsettling conclusion that the God of the Bible operates by a code far removed from what humans would consider fair or loving. Throughout the Bible, there are numerous examples of God punishing innocent people for the wrongdoings of others. In the story of the Great Flood, all of humanity, except Noah's family, is wiped out. In the plagues of Egypt, Pharaoh's stubbornness leads to the death of Egypt's firstborn sons, most of whom had no involvement in his decisions. Even in the New Testament, the foundational idea of salvation is built on the concept of Jesus' death as a payment for the sins of others. While some see this as divine justice, others see a troubling pattern: collective punishment and the suffering of innocents for crimes they did not commit. This stands in contrast to our modern understanding of justice, which is based on individual responsibility. If God is truly all-powerful, he could hold individuals accountable without harming the innocent, yet the biblical narrative repeatedly shows him choosing otherwise. The Bible frequently describes God as jealous and prone to anger. In Exodus 20:5, He declares himself a jealous God who will punish children for the sins of their parents to the third and fourth generation. Episodes like the fiery destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the instant killing of Uzzah for touching the Ark of the Covenant, highlight a deity quick to react with lethal force. While human emotions like jealousy and rage are often linked to insecurity and volatility, the Bible depicts these traits as integral to God's nature. Critics argue that such characteristics are incompatible with the idea of a perfect, loving being. Instead, they paint a picture of a deity whose behavior sometimes resembles that of a tyrant, rewarding loyalty but crushing opposition without mercy. The Bible contains numerous stories where God shows compassion to a chosen few while ignoring or even opposing others in similar situations. For example, in Exodus, God miraculously parts the Red Sea to save the Israelites from the Egyptians, but later, in other parts of history, countless innocent people in equally dire situations receive no such help. The issue here is not that miracles are rare, but that God's compassion appears partial, often reserved for those within a specific covenant or lineage. Critics argue that such selectivity undermines the notion of a universally loving deity. If love is truly unconditional, it should not depend on ethnicity, geography, or political allegiance. Instead, the pattern suggests favoritism, helping certain groups while allowing others to suffer without intervention. This selective compassion reinforces the idea that the biblical God's actions are more in line with tribal loyalty than with an all-encompassing, unbiased benevolence. In Genesis, God destroys the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah with fire and brimstone because of their wickedness. While the story is often cited as an example of divine justice, the scale of the punishment is staggering. Entire populations wiped out, including children, the elderly, and possibly those unaware of the supposed sins. Even Lot's wife, who simply looked back at the burning cities, was turned into a pillar of salt. Critics see this as another instance of collective punishment that disregards individual innocence. Moreover, the nature of the alleged crimes is debated. Some interpretations focus on inhospitality rather than sexual immorality, raising further questions about whether such extreme destruction was justified. By modern moral standards, indiscriminate mass killing is viewed as deeply unethical, regardless of the offenses involved. This story, for many, paints a portrait of a God whose sense of justice can be terrifyingly absolute. A recurring theme in the Bible is God hardening people's hearts, preventing them from making moral choices that could avert disaster. In Exodus, God hardens Pharaoh's heart multiple times, ensuring that he refuses to free the Israelites until several devastating plagues have occurred. This raises a troubling question. If God controls a person's willingness to repent or change, how can that person be held accountable for their actions? Critics argue that this removes free will, making God the direct cause of subsequent suffering. The plagues of Egypt, which killed both people and animals indiscriminately, could have been avoided if Pharaoh had been allowed to act differently. Instead, the text portrays God as intentionally escalating the conflict to display his power. Such manipulation challenges the idea of divine justice, suggesting that the suffering in these narratives is sometimes orchestrated for spectacle rather than necessity. The Book of Job presents one of the most famous examples of God allowing immense suffering to test a person's faith. Job, a righteous man, loses his children, wealth, and health in a wager between God and Satan. While the story is often interpreted as a lesson in perseverance, critics focus on the morality of using human pain as a demonstration of loyalty. Job's suffering is not a consequence of wrongdoing, it's inflicted as part of a cosmic bet. In modern ethical terms, inflicting, or allowing, harm to prove a point would be seen as deeply immoral. Furthermore, Job's eventual restoration does not undo the trauma or loss he experienced. This narrative portrays a God willing to gamble with human lives, prioritizing his own vindication over the immediate well-being of his followers. Numerous passages depict God directly causing or ordering the deaths of children. In 2 Kings 2:23-24, 2 bears maul 42 boys after they mock the prophet Elisha, a punishment the text attributes to divine action. In the 10th plague of Egypt, all the firstborn sons die, regardless of innocence. Even in the conquest of Canaan, children are included in the mass killings. From a moral standpoint, the deliberate killing of children is among the most universally condemned actions. Yet the biblical narrative records these events as acts of divine judgment. Critics argue that this reveals a level of cruelty inconsistent with the idea of a loving father figure. Instead of protecting the most vulnerable, the God of these stories appears to treat them as collateral damage, or even as targets within his larger plans. One of the most unsettling biblical accounts is the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son as a test of faith. Although the sacrifice is halted at the last moment, the psychological trauma and moral implications remain. Critics argue that the very act of demanding such obedience, requiring a parent to be willing to kill their own child, demonstrates an alarming disregard for human morality. In any modern context, such an order would be condemned outright as abusive and monstrous. Defenders of the passage say it was a test to show Abraham's trust, but this raises troubling questions. Why would an all-knowing God need proof of loyalty? And why would loyalty be measured by willingness to commit filicide? This story continues to be cited as an example of divine morality being fundamentally different, and perhaps even incompatible with human ethics. The Great Flood in Genesis 6-9 is often told as a children's story, but in reality, it's a narrative of mass death on an unimaginable scale. God decides to destroy all living creatures on Earth, except for those in Noah's Ark, because of humanity's wickedness. This judgment includes animals, infants, and people who may not have participated in the alleged corruption. While the story ends with a covenant symbolized by the rainbow, the magnitude of the destruction raises serious ethical concerns. If God is omnipotent, could he not have reformed humanity without annihilating nearly every living thing? Critics argue that this act resembles the behavior of a ruler who chooses to obliterate rather than rehabilitate. The flood story is often seen as the clearest example of a divine reset button, one that disregards the lives of the innocent in favor of starting over with a select few. There are multiple passages in the Bible where God either sends lying spirits or allows deception to occur for his purposes. In 1 Kings 22, God permits a lying spirit to mislead King Ahab into going to battle, which leads to his death. In 2 Thessalonians 2:11, Paul writes that God sends a powerful delusion so that people will believe a lie. These accounts raise an uncomfortable question. If God is the ultimate source of truth, why would he intentionally mislead? Defenders may argue it's a form of judgment, but critics contend that deliberate deception undermines trust and moral integrity. In human terms, lying to manipulate someone's decisions is considered unethical, especially when the consequences are fatal. This portrayal challenges the idea of God as a consistently honest and transparent being. The Bible, especially the Old Testament, contains numerous laws and practices that reflect and reinforce the subjugation of women. Women are often treated as property, given in marriage, counted among possessions, and valued less than men in legal contexts. In Deuteronomy 22, laws about sexual assault focus on compensating the woman's father, not on the woman's rights or consent. In Numbers 5, the ordeal of bitter water allows a husband to subject his wife to a humiliating ritual if he suspects her of infidelity without the need for evidence. Critics argue that a truly just and loving God would establish laws protecting women equally rather than codifying patriarchal norms. While some claim these rules were progressive for the time, the fact remains that they perpetuate inequality and injustice, raising doubts about whether they reflect eternal divine morality or human cultural bias. Throughout the Old Testament, God's special covenant with Israel often results in favoritism toward one nation over all others. While this is central to the narrative of the Hebrew Bible, it poses moral questions about fairness and impartiality. Nations outside of Israel are frequently portrayed as enemies to be defeated, destroyed, or subjugated, often regardless of individual innocence. This divine nationalism reinforces tribalism, rewarding loyalty to a specific group while condemning outsiders. Critics argue that an all-loving God would show equal concern for all people, regardless of ethnic or national identity. Instead, the biblical pattern suggests a deity whose protection and blessings are conditional on belonging to a particular lineage, which conflicts with the idea of universal moral concern. In several passages, God declares that the consequences of sin will be passed down to future generations. Exodus 20:5 states that he will punish the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. This principle of inherited guilt directly contradicts modern concepts of justice, which hold individuals accountable only for their own actions. Children are portrayed as suffering divine judgment for crimes they did not commit, suggesting a system in which innocence offers no protection. While some later passages, such as Ezekiel 18, emphasize individual responsibility, the earlier laws and pronouncements remain troubling. Critics argue that such generational curses reveal a moral framework more aligned with ancient superstition than with a truly just and loving deity. The Bible records multiple instances where animals suffer as a result of human sins or divine judgment. During the plagues of Egypt, livestock are killed by disease, hail, and other disasters. In the story of Jonah, the animals of Nineveh are forced into fasting and mourning alongside the people. The flood narrative also wipes out nearly all animal life on Earth. Critics question why innocent creatures, without moral agency, should be subjected to such punishment. If God is all-powerful, could he not spare non-human life while still addressing human wrongdoing? These accounts raise questions about divine compassion toward all living beings, not just humans, and suggest a willingness to use widespread suffering as a blunt instrument of justice. In Deuteronomy 13, God commands the execution of anyone, family, friends, or entire communities, who tries to lead others to worship different gods. These laws mandate not just death for apostates, but the destruction of entire towns, including their inhabitants and livestock. Such severity is viewed by critics as extreme religious intolerance, enforcing belief through fear of death rather than through persuasion or free will. In modern societies, religious freedom is seen as a fundamental right, and killing someone for changing their beliefs is considered barbaric. The fact that these laws are presented as divine commands challenges the idea of God as a champion of individual conscience and freedom. While monogamy is often upheld as the ideal in modern Christian teaching, the Old Testament shows numerous examples of God's chosen leaders practicing polygamy and keeping concubines without divine condemnation. Figures like King Solomon and King David had multiple wives and concubines, often acquired through political alliances or as spoils of war. The laws in Exodus and Deuteronomy regulate rather than prohibit these practices, implying acceptance. Critics point out that this normalization of treating women as possessions or symbols of status is inconsistent with the idea of a God who values equality and mutual respect in relationships. While loyalty is a natural expectation in human relationships, demanding it under threat of annihilation paints a picture of a deity who rules through fear rather than love. Critics liken this to authoritarianism, where dissent is crushed and conformity is mandated. If God's love is truly unconditional, why would it require the complete eradication of alternative beliefs? This demand for absolute worship, coupled with the punishments for disobedience, challenges the portrayal of God as a compassionate and patient ruler. The 10 plagues in Exodus are often celebrated as a dramatic display of God's power, but when examined closely, they reveal a troubling pattern of collective suffering. These plagues targeted not only Pharaoh and his officials, but also ordinary Egyptians who had no control over the king's decisions. Innocent people endured famine, disease, boils, and death, culminating in the killing of every firstborn son. Even animals were struck down. Critics argue that this indiscriminate approach reflects a willingness to harm entire populations to punish one ruler, An omnipotent God could have acted precisely against Pharaoh without devastating the wider population, yet the biblical account shows a preference for large-scale destruction. While the narrative frames the plagues as a liberation story for the Israelites, the cost in human and animal life raises serious ethical questions about whether such signs and wonders were acts of justice or excessive cruelty. In Numbers 31, God commands the Israelites to attack the Midianites, kill all the men, and take the women and children as captives. Later, Moses, following God's orders, tells them to kill all the boys and any woman who has had sexual relations, keeping only virgin girls alive. This passage has long been criticized for endorsing what would now be considered war crimes, including the execution of children and the sexual enslavement of captives. The text presents these actions as divinely sanctioned, framing them as righteous vengeance. Critics argue that this represents one of the most explicit examples of biblical morality clashing with modern ethics. If God is supposed to embody perfect justice, his direct involvement in such atrocities forces us to question whether that justice is compatible with basic human compassion. In Judges 11, the warrior Jephthah makes a vow to God. If granted victory in battle, he will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house to greet him.